afternoon and welcome to our Friends of Wheeling tour. Today is January 7th, 2024. My real name is Jeanne Finstein and I'm currently president of Friends of Wheeling. This is our first tour for 2024, and if you are not a member of Friends of Wheeling and you'd like to join us to see these lovely mansions in Wheeling and other things, I do have membership cards right here in front of the Christmas tree, and they'll be here. It's pretty expensive, $10 a year, and then you'll be on our mailing list. So now I will switch from being Jeanne Finstein to being Bertha Bloch.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Bertha Bloch, and this is my home. We called it Elmhurst. My husband Samuel planted many elm trees here, and so that's how the name derived. I lived here for more than 40 years. So it feels like home, and it's so nice to have some guests today. A little bit of history. Is this still working?
Yes.
I was born in 1861. It seems to have stopped.
That's good.
Okay, I was born in 1861 in Parkersburg. Now, that was even before West Virginia was a state. My husband Samuel was a little bit older. He was born in 1850 right here in Wheeling. Both of us had parents who were German immigrants. They were part of a large number of German Jews who came to the United States before the Civil War to seek their fortunes. And both of our fathers were very successful. My father was a dry goods merchant in Parkersburg. Sadly, he died when I was about 10 years old. Samuel's father, whose name was also Solomon, they were both Solomons, was also a merchant, but died when Samuel was only about 15. Samuel had a younger brother, 6 years younger, whose name was Aaron, and together the boys decided that they needed to make a living. So they had a store of their own in the 1500 block of Main Street. Now, the building's not there anymore, but it's about where there's a parking garage. And they had on the first floor a grocery, and on the second floor they manufactured tobacco products. Now, tobacco was a big deal in Wheeling back in the day. There were cigar manufacturers everywhere. There were big companies, there were little mom and pop shops. And the cigars, when they were made, ended up with a lot of little cuttings when they would cut off the ends when they made the cigars. And so Samuel and his brother, Aaron, had the good idea of taking those cuttings and packaging them loose, along with some flavoring, licorice, and things like that, and putting them in a soft bag that became known as mail pouch. And they became very successful. In fact, there were barn signs all over the countryside that advertised mail pouch tobacco. And they made a lot of money, but they worked very hard. In those early years, they say that they worked sometimes until 10 o'clock at night to fill orders. And there was one year that the only day they had as a day off was Christmas Day. So they worked very hard and were very successful. In 1884, there was a big flood in Wheeling, and the first floor of their store on Main Street was flooded. So they said, okay, we're going to forget the grocery business and we're just going to focus on the tobacco business, and that's what they did. They moved to 40th Street in South Wheeling, and that's where the factory still is to this day. In the meantime, Samuel and I were married and raising a family. I was only 17 when we married. Samuel was 29. And we set up housekeeping on North Main Street at 903 North Main, and my mother-in-law, Helen, who was a widow then, of course, lived right next door at number 905. Now, sadly, those houses are no longer there either. The interstate went through and took off that part, the 900 block of Main Street. We had a total of 5 children, and let me tell you a little bit about those. Our firstborn was Jess. And we have a portrait of Jess on this wall, and those of you who are in the front room can come in later and see it. Jess was a very important part of the business, but was also a politician of sorts. He, when we lived in this house, actually was at one point the mayor of this little neighborhood, Pleasant Valley, before this was part of Wheeling. And he was a member of the West Virginia State Legislature, and then became a senator, a West Virginia State Senator. Now, he's remembered in this politician role a couple of ways. One was he was the person who made sure that the state government passed the Workmen's Compensation Act. He was very involved with the welfare of his workers, and that was a way to help protect them. The second way we remember him is from Women's Lib. Do you believe that back in the day they would not let women vote? It's just unheard of. And so finally the U.S. government passed an amendment to the Constitution allowing women's suffrage, but they said that 3/4 of the states had to ratify that amendment for it to become a law. And so West Virginia was toward the end, maybe 33rd state, I'm not sure, out of the 35 that needed to be ratified. Anyway, the state legislature passed the ratification. The state senate was a tie. And our son Jess and his wife Jessie, I'll talk about her in just a minute, were on vacation in California and had to rush back to Charleston, taking the fastest train they could find, and make the vote for women's suffrage. So thank you, Jess. Now you ladies can vote. Jess was married to a lovely girl. Her name was Jessie Moffat, and her portrait is on the back wall over there. She's in a white gown. Now there was a little bit of uneasiness with their engagement because she was a Presbyterian. Now her grandfather and her uncle were both Presbyterian ministers, and both had served at some point at Second Presbyterian Church in Wheeling. Now by this time, Samuel's brother Aaron had died in New York, but he left a good bit of his estate to Jess, with the provision that Jess marry Jessie. And so it happened, and they were married in Vance Memorial Presbyterian Church, and that branch of the family has continued to be Presbyterians to this day. So Jess and Jessie had 2 children. They had a son named Tom, and Tom married the daughter of William and Martha Fulton. Tom's wife's name was Nancy Fulton. So William Fulton was one of the founders of Wheeling Clinic, and he and his wife have portraits on this wall in the sitting room. Their son was Stuart, and many of you will remember Stuart Bloch. Stuart and his wife Stephanie were very active members of the Wheeling community, and we miss them terribly. Their son was Tom, one of their 4 children, and Tom, being my great-great-grandson, is actually visiting with us today. Tom, give a wave back there. Tom, thank you so much for coming from Charleston to visit with us today.
Absolutely, I wouldn't miss it.
Now, Stuart had a sister whose name was Betty. Betty, actually after I was dead, was scheduled to be married, and there was a huge scandal because there was a plot to kidnap her. And so the police were everywhere. She still had all of the typical engagement parties all around town. But there were policemen everywhere, and they did capture the two men who planned to kidnap her, and they were arrested, and things went well for the rest of the wedding. So that's kind of the line that comes through Jess, our son. Our second child was a little girl named Blanche, and sadly Blanche died when we were still living on North Main Street. When she was only 7 years old, she had meningitis. Then came a son, Harold, and Harold lived most of his life in New York City and here, and had a nice penthouse apartment and also some property in the suburbs. Our fourth child was a daughter named Madeline. And Madeline actually has a bust here in the house, which is under the picture of her uncle Jess. Her brother Jess, let me make sure I get this right. Madeline was a lovely young girl, and she was born about the time we moved into this house. 1891-ish. Well, Madeline fell in love with and married a Frenchman. And I actually have a photograph of their wedding in France, in Paris. And they lived most of the time in Paris, and I'll put this here on the table beside the Friends Wheeling cards. And so we visited them a lot. Now, of course, to get to France from the United States, we had to take a ship. And it took quite a while. And so when we would visit, we would stay for several months in France to visit. Her husband's name was Edward Ziegler. And they had a son who they also named Edward. When Edward Jr. was just a toddler, World War I broke out in Europe. And so Edward Jr. came and lived with us in this house for his own safety. Now, Edward Jr. grew up to be a man and was part of World War II and was captured by the Germans and was a prisoner of war for close to 5 years. Now, fortunately, that was after I was gone too, or I really would have been worried. Edward Jr., after the war, came to the United States, worked a while in New York, and then came here to Wheeling and was the treasurer of Bloch Brothers Tobacco. He and his wife, Simone, were very active in the Wheeling community. They were on the board of directors of the symphony and a variety of other things. And you'll see his name on the Wheeling Crippled Children's Building, just up the street from here, Edward Ziegler. So when you pass by that building, remember him as a descendant of this family. So that was our fourth child, a daughter, and our fifth child was another daughter named Dorothy. Dorothy married a New Yorker named Stephen Hirsch, and they spent most of their time there. And so, of course, we visited them as well. Now, by the time our children were married, Samuel didn't have to work as much, and so we traveled a great deal. So we would spend, as I said, months in Paris and months in New York. We had an apartment at the Dorset. The Dorset was a large apartment building in the Upper West Side on Millionaires Row, along with the Rockefellers and the Blumenthal's and those sorts. Sadly, that building is no longer there either. It's part of the Museum of Modern Art complex in New York City. So if you go to New York and visit the Museum of Modern Art, just think that was where we used to stay. And it was there at the Dorset where we had our 50th wedding anniversary celebration. We had a special menu made for the dinner that we had to celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary, and I'll put this here on this little stand as well, so you can see us when we were married and then see us 50 years later. Of course, we started with caviar, and you can read the rest of the menu. And we have a scrapbook here of the messages, the telegrams and the notes and the cards that were on flowers that were sent to us when we celebrated our anniversary. So that scrapbook is right here in the house. Now, a couple years later, our anniversary, by the way, was 1929, and in 1932 we were in Europe again, touring and motoring around. and having just a wonderful time. And the other scrapbook that is here has pictures of that trip. So it's wonderful to reminisce that wonderful time in our life. That was early in 1932, in the springtime, and we came back to Wheeling in October of 1932 to visit and stay here in this house. On November the 2nd of 1932, we were preparing to go back to New York to travel again. And a friend of mine, Florence Ott, who lived in Howard Place, invited me and my daughter-in-law, Jessie, to a tea. So we went to a tea, had a lovely time, scheduled to leave the next day, came home, walked in the house, I took off my coat and hat, and dropped out of a heart attack. Oh. But if you have to go, you know, that's the way to go. We enjoyed life, we traveled, we thoroughly enjoyed our lives. Now Samuel was older, as I mentioned before, but he lived another 5 years. I was 71 when I died, and Samuel was 87. And again, he was here in the house. He was having dinner with his doctor, Dr. Robert Reed. They were sitting at the dining room table, and Samuel had a heart attack and dropped dead. Again, it's the way to go. So what to do with the house? Now, the family already had a history of philanthropy. For our 50th wedding anniversary, for instance, our 4 surviving children went together and donated $200,000 to Ohio Valley General Hospital for the nurses' residence. I think that building may be going down starting tomorrow. For that same anniversary, we donated $20,000 to the children's wing in memory of our little girl, Blanche, who had died as a child. So philanthropy was big in the family. So what do we do with this house? Our children, our grandchildren already had homes. And so they decided to donate it to an organization that was called the Home for Aged and Friendless Women. It already existed, had started around 1888, 1890, in there somewhere, along with another similar organization called Altenheim that was started by Anton Raymond. So there were these two organizations. You know, back at that time, women didn't necessarily work. And so when they got old, and if they were widows or had never married, they had no resources. Or, especially for Altenheim, Anton Raymond was concerned about the women who had come here as immigrants and had worked in the homes as domestic servants in homes like ours. But again, when they get old, can't scrub the floors anymore, can't wash the dishes, and so what's to be done? Can't send them back to Germany or to Ireland, and so Altenheim was established specifically for them. So we had those two organizations, and I actually was on the board of women supervisors. The board of directors was only men. I was on the board of women supervisors for that other organization, the one called the Home for Aged and Friendless Women. Now, by the way, the residents at that time were called inmates. So if you see people here in the building today, they probably don't call themselves inmates. And so in 1940, this building was donated to that organization. Since then, it has grown in size significantly. We had already added the porte cochere in 1911, where the cars could drive in and we didn't get wet if it was raining. But the other additions were added later on. You'll see the lovely decorations. Wheeling's Mary Beth Hughes was the designer, and I think it's lovely. As you walk through the building, you'll see that the same types of decorations are throughout, whether it's a part of the new building or the original. And now this is home for men, women, and couples. And my understanding is there are actually a couple vacancies, so maybe some of you won't leave today, and so you'll become some of the inmates. So I thank you for your attention today, and there will be people who will take you on a tour of the rest of the facility. Thank you.
Thank you.